So Joe Su, they, them, is an associate professor of rhetoric and writing and women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Texas at Austin. They're the author of Constellating Home, Trans and Queer Asian American Rhetorics. And their work explores how storytelling shapes policy and culture. They're currently working on several projects related to anti-trans rhetoric, narratives of pathologization, and contested diseases. The title of Joe's talk is The Burden of Proof and Other Stories, Reimagining Evidence from the Transcript Diaspora. So please join me in welcoming Joe Su. Mine there, and it's right there.
Hello, friends. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for this chance to speak with everyone. How's my volume? Can you hear me okay? A little bit louder? Project more? Is that better? Okay, thank you. So, some of you in this room have seen an earlier version of this, so I'm actually kind of looking forward to what you think now. There's some ways that my family of birth hews uncomfortably close to the myth of the American dream. My parents came here with few connections and no roots, and raised a child who grew up with opportunities beyond their aspirations. And playing a little too close to type, I balked at the expectations that I become a lawyer or a physician, the right kind of doctor. And it seemed I threw away generations of sacrifice for love of storytelling. So I've spent a lot of my adulthood wondering for what? What work, what life, what future is worth the stability promised by a family's one American upbringing and American education? Who am I to deny the people who traded their comfort and safety for mine? There are many problems with that read of my story, which we'll get to in a bit. I'm opening there, though, to provide some context for how and why I keep asking myself, what am I doing here? What does it mean to study communication, story, ethnic studies, gender, and disability? What does it mean to study diversity and equity and inclusion and all those forbidden words at a moment when they're being scrubbed from our national consciousness? How does one live in a body that doesn't get to escape those words? Here's where I go. I forgot that there are access copies. So you can get there with the QR code. The captions are covering the URL, but it's bit.ly Joe visits Victoria, all lowercase.
So we can work on those captions.
You should be able to get the QR code anyway. Bitly might warn you that it has scanned my documents and made sure that they are not malware, and then you just have to click through. I promise I'm not bugging your phone or anything. All right. I've been thinking a lot about how in the educationally privileged spaces of universities, we've often relied on the data. We will find the peer-reviewed articles. We will give you, with citations, all the science that affirms our positions. I have done so much of that in recent years. But it's also ironic that we invoke the name of science as if it were in any way objective, especially those of us who study histories of race and gender and disability. We, the people who know and critique histories and present practices of eugenics, who can recount for you how trans medicine emerged as a means of containing gender diversity. We, who know from lived experience failure after failure of modern medicine to care for the chronically ill, the neurodivergent, and the poor or broken or different among us. So I've been thinking about how story picks up where logic and traditional forms of evidence fail. How, like any tool, stories can be useful or dangerous. And like any tool, the less we understand it, the more likely it is to hurt us. This, of course, is work that has plenty of precedent. Disability studies scholar Ellen Samuels uses the term lyric theory to describe where imagination meets argument at a point of tension. Here, story is not mere anecdote to introduce an analysis, but is itself doing the work of theory, if we consider that theory is an attempt to explain and in the process create the world we inhabit. This is theory as modeled by Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa and Bell Hooks, who give us story as liberatory practice. a place where I could imagine possible futures, a place where life could be lived differently. Choctaw scholar Leanne Howe uses story, history, and theory interchangeably because the difference is artificially constructed to privilege writing over speaking, which is to say that story as knowledge is not new, it is fundamental. It is the basis of what we call reality. The idea of the lyric for me evokes the lyric essay, which references a form of nonfiction that emphasizes image and fragmented storytelling. Eli Clare describes it as mosaic, as if he were reconfiguring an already broken world so that we could see it differently. Natasha Jones, Kristen Moore, and Rebecca Walton explore anti-narrative as a polyvocal, dynamic, and fragmented, yet highly interconnected way of knowing and disrupting convention. When I'm trying to make sense of this world, I return to such forms: lyric, mosaic, interconnected fragments, a kind of creative scavenging that tries to make something of this wreckage. In adding to this mosaic of knowledge making, I'm trying to set my stories beside those of many others, expanding our understandings of story and experiential knowledge, including Counter Story from Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, and other critical race theorists, Remi Yergeau's authoring of Neurodivergence, and Marr Jurelle Bruce's Mad Methodology. I'm inspired by a diverse and sprawling body of work that understands feeling as knowledge, often into worlds that conventional reason was meant to obscure. For example, Dion Millen's felt theory, Cameron Awkward-Ridge's maladjustment, and Hill Malatino's many side affects. If there were a research question here, it would sound something like, what can fragmented storytelling reveal about where language and logic break, and what can it do differently? Or if I were to go more specific, it would sound something like, how can a mosaic help situate trans and queer Asian American experiences within broader histories of US colonialism and imperialism, of interpersonal and collective harm and healing? Or if I were to go a little more meta, it would sound something like, how should rhetoricians, in my case, or other scholars, engage story as complicated, theoretically rich, and necessary to understanding meaning making? If there were a method, it might be what Loretta Lemaster explores through relational autoethnography. It would fit Ellen Samuels's lyric theory or Eli Clare's mosaic. It suits what Jian Chen calls a trans of color critique as a set of counter-imaginaries and analytics that mobilize potential points of solidarity and kinship. But if nothing else, I hope you see it as my attempt to respond to Lord's litany for survival. I've been writing for as long as I've had words because it could give me a handle on the world to hold me steady. And I've sent that writing out in hopes that someone else could use it too. And this is a content note for those in the room. There are mentions of violence targeting Asians and Asian Americans and other forms of racial violence and mentions of suicide. I encourage you to check in with yourself with where you are today, to move in and out of the room as you feel needed, and to honor your capacity. By the time Everything Everywhere All at Once hit movie theaters, we were already over the multiverse. In 2022, Marvel had already saturated the market with sequels and spin-offs where superheroes warp into different versions of their realities. Negative reviews of Everything Everywhere frequently remarked on this unoriginality. In the Saturday Evening Post, Bill Newcott asks, quote, "Can we all agree the parallel universe genre is played out?" The New Yorker's Richard Brody describes Everything Everywhere as a sickly, cynical, feature-length directorial pitch reel for a Marvel movie. Even as the film swept the Oscars, Esquire called it, quote, "one of the award season's most alienating," and The Independent ranked it fourth on their list of 25 of the most overrated films ever. So I hesitate to begin this story here with unoriginality. But I'm not sure originality is the point of a genre that explores many iterations of one person, that folds and splits a timeline over and over again. I'm also not convinced that the idea of originality was invented for anything other than theft. Marvel, of course, did not invent the multiverse. Some versions of history trace it to Greco-Roman traditions, citing Democritus. Others have noted its resonances in Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies. Anthropologist Arturo Escobar points to the traditions of Africa and indigenous people of the Americas. The idea that there's a definitive and singular reality is a myth made by conquest. It is a presumption that Western science speaks objective truth, and all other cosmologies are fanciful imaginings of underdeveloped societies. At the center of Everything Everywhere is Evelyn Wang, played by Michelle Yeoh, an immigrant struggling to hold her business, her marriage, and her family together. The IRS is auditing the laundromat that she runs with her husband. That husband is threatening to divorce her. Their daughter has brought her girlfriend home at the same time that Evelyn's tradition-bound father is living with them. The multiverse is a mechanic through which the movie explores the displacements and disorientations of immigrant life. When Evelyn is first introduced to the multiverse, we zip through a dizzying recap of her past. Alpha Waymond is an alternate reality version of her husband, who stops her in an elevator and equips her with 2 Bluetooth earpieces while buffeting her with instructions. The earpieces light up. Evelyn's eyes snap wide open. The camera pushes through the elevator doors. We see through the eyes of infant Evelyn as she's delivered into the hands of her father. A doctor's voice says from off camera, "I'm sorry, it's a girl." Kid Evelyn in a classroom doodling an image of the boy in front of her. It's Waymond. Evelyn and Waymond as young adults on an apartment balcony. Gong Gong's voice overhead. "If you abandon this family for that silly boy, then we will abandon you." Evelyn and Waymond move to America. They buy a laundromat. Evelyn is pregnant. Joy is a kid running gleefully through the laundromat. Joy is older, shouting at her mother. More anger, more disappointment. A close-up of Evelyn back in the elevator, stricken with the magnitude of what has been and what could be. I was struck, though not shocked, by the number of critics who called the movie unrelatable. For Brody, the characters lack any personal connection to the wider world, and for film critic Jordan Rumi, the movie is, quote, devoid of human feeling. The Saturday Evening Post complains that the movie is poundingly frenetic when in reality it has no heart to begin with. I can't help but notice that a majority of negative criticisms of Everything Everywhere describe the characters as so unrelatable that they don't seem human. I can't help but think that those critics would say the same about my actual life. For me, the problems and emotions at the center of Everything Everywhere cut so close to the bone that I find it almost unbearable to watch. It is one of my favorite films, but I've only seen it once because sitting before it felt like trying to behold the sun. Like encountering something so powerful, it could burn me alive. Writing about the pluriverse, Escobar explains, reality is a proposition that we use to explain our experiences. Different cultures and different moments in time naturally beget different explanations. It would take outrageous hubris to presume that your reality is the only reality. Say the hubris of demanding that all media be relatable for you, or the hubris of deporting immigrants from a land you occupy through force, or the hubris of disparaging the global South as backwards and superstitious while building expensive yoga studios and acupuncture clinics, or the hubris of declaring pain or discrimination non-existent simply because you, personally, don't experience it. The notion of the Asian devoid of human feeling, or the Asian robot, extends as far back as Aristotle, who called Asians intelligent and inventive, but wanting in spirit and therefore always in a state of subjection and slavery. In the 1880s, Western journalists and government officials described Asian indentured laborers as, quote, natural substitutes for actual machines. And far more recently, US corporations, including Apple, Hewlett-Packard, and Dell, have all been exposed for treating Chinese factory workers as machines, requiring them to complete tasks every 3 seconds over a 12-hour period without speaking or using the bathroom. In a video essay, Michelle Huang details the racialized history of the robot, alien, and clone, all means of rendering Asian Americans as inhuman, dispassionate, unoriginal, and strange. As Long Thi Bui explains, the earliest novels about space aliens, quote, were all written at the height of anti-Chinese prejudice, and this synchronicity underlined the mass hallucination of Asian migration as an alien invasion. This figure is at the core of Asian American racialization. On the surface, the dichotomy of the model minority and the yellow peril might seem like two ends of a spectrum, but it's actually the same ambivalence with which we approach things like generative AI, as non-agentic tools exploitable for human convenience, but that are potentially dangerous when unleashed outside of human control. Everything Everywhere came out as anti-Asian sentiment escalated across the United States, alongside the interrelated trans antagonism and anti-Black violence. The ire directed at Asians amid COVID-19 felt more like an eruption of long simmering resentment. It felt like a nation's history uncorked. If this were an academic essay, I would give you the data. I would tell you that the number of anti-Asian attacks that resulted in death or injury in 2020 and 2021 was over 11 times the prior average. I would tell you that in 2021, 1 in 6 Asian Americans experienced a hate incident, 1 in 4 were told to go back to your country, 1 in 10 was physically assaulted or threatened physically, and 1 in 10 had been coughed on or spat on, an experience so common it needed its own category. If this were an academic essay, I might insist on this as evidence that our experiences are worthy of attention. Except most polling in the United States is done exclusively in English, leaving out the third of Asian Americans with limited English proficiency. Asian Americans are also the least likely of any racial demographic to report experiencing a crime. And also, what is the validity of crime as a statistic in a carceral system designed to target Black and brown and disabled and gender nonconforming people? Asian Americans at 6% of the US population are often left entirely out of studies or considered too small of a participant pool for generalizable results. As the Pew Research Center explains, a perfectly representative national survey of 1,000 adults would include 59 Asian Americans. Quote, far too few to support reliable estimates. Data justice is important. The lack of information around many marginalized experiences makes it harder to argue for resources or interventions or to design effective solutions. For example, the US federal government continually withheld COVID-19 data from tribal health authorities, even as Native Americans and Alaskan Natives experienced 3 times the infection rates of white people. For example, the absence of funding and research into trans health outcomes gets continually leveraged into arguments against gender-affirming care, as if we did not have innumerable lifetimes of evidence that forcing a trans teen through cisgender puberty is already harmful. For example, between 1992 and 2018, the amount of the NIH budget that went to studies centering Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and/or Pacific Islanders was 0.17%. We do need more data. Except data alone do not make an argument. The history of our profession as academics is one of weaponized data, of logics that culminate in eugenics, conversion therapy, incarceration, institutionalization, and other means of containing and excising difference. For me, the data that 40% of unhoused youth are trans and/or queer is an injustice and a collective failure. For white Christian nationalism, it's the point. For the natalists who convened this year on my university campus, proof of an increasingly diversified America is a clarion call for raising white birth rates. It is further reason to defund programs that teach and address racial and gender justice. It is justification for reproductive control, for the anti-abortion policies that have in Texas caused a dramatic rise in maternal deaths. No amount of data will teach us what is good or urgent or heartbreaking. And if you're wondering, it is in fact $10,000 to attend the racist conference. The writer Daniel Ortberg described the experience of coming out as trans with this line that I know by heart. I just feel like I've handed you a weapon. And even though you say, I love you, I promise I will never use this bow and arrow, which has been specifically fashioned to find your heart, you're still holding it. So I felt like I was giving away something that could kill me. For me, this is a statement not specifically about coming out as trans, but about any honest account of marginalization. When I tell you this hurts, I'm also giving you the chance to say, I don't care. Writer and scholar Anne Ong Cheng describes Everything Everywhere as an exploration of Asian American nihilism. A collective, nothing matters, as centuries of discrimination, often unacknowledged, boiled over into explicit acts of murderous violence. This nihilism takes the form of Joy's alter ego, Jobu Tupaki. In one world, Joy is the disaffected daughter of Chinese immigrants grating against her mother's expectations. In a different world, the Alphaverse, Jobu is a Joy beyond her breaking point. Jobu has mastered verse jumping, that is, moving from universe to universe, touring all the wild refractions of her life. She has seen everything that could have been and lived every supposed impossibility, and if nothing is impossible, if everything that could happen already is happening, then nothing we do matters. I find it so apt that she's named Joy, this character who's introduced staring despondently into a washing machine, who spends most of the movie so disillusioned by the world that she has to destroy it. Her name tells a story that others imagined for her before she was here, before she was her. As Erin Nin and Mimi Cook explain, precarity overwrites family relations to form an economic unit. For migrant families who arrive with no networks and few avenues for community, everyone must contribute to the collective survival. The sacrifice demanded of immigrant families is not some inevitable fate, but a contrivance of US belonging. And the story of debt that contours so many migrant families is not some foreign cultural value, but a product of US capitalism and its economies of abandonment. Central to Escobar's pluriverse is the understanding that everything is connected. Modes of domination, colonialism, capitalism, imperialism need to divide to conquer. By imagining humans as independent of our environments, we justify extraction and devastation. By imagining people of different skin tones and geographic origins as fundamentally unequal, white settlers legitimize the enslavement of African peoples, the seizure of indigenous lands, the exclusion of Asian indentured laborers and migrants. By narrativizing Asians as, quote, ideal human machines and the best industrial animal that can be produced at the price, white America honed a continent of people and their descendants into a racial wedge, one indispensable to Western racial hegemony, yet continually disavowed as foreign intrusion. If this were an argument, this is where I would underscore that Asian American experiences are not unique or uniquely horrific in US history, but they are integral to how whiteness operates. For white settler colonialism to perpetuate the myth of its own benevolence and progressivism, it needs to continually suppress these experiences. The story of Asian America is both about that suppression and about how colonialism covers its own tracks. So when Cornell University found that 61% of students who died by suicide over a 10-year period were Asian American, even though Asian Americans comprise only 14% of the student population, the university blamed Asian immigrant family culture, the pressure felt by, quote, immigrant groups due to sacrifices made by family members for their children's benefit. When mental health professionals discuss the fact that Asian Americans are least likely to seek or receive mental health support, they overwhelmingly reference Asian culture and the cultural need to save face. Studies also find that Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian patients are least likely to have their pain documented and receive the fewest opioids. They say that Asian patients are the least likely to report experiencing pain. As a chronically ill Asian American who can no longer remember a world not shaded by pain, I wonder, what do I have to tear open to prove that I bleed? And what would it change if I did? Escobar points out the irony in appealing to reason in place of emotion. He says that desire in itself is an emotional and selective decision. It's also disingenuous. Entire nations are structured by white fear and entitlement. The sensitivities of cis men are so dangerous that all women, femmes, and other trans people learn to navigate them. And many scholars and theorists have explained anti-Blackness and xenophobia are deep-rooted, lethal feelings. In place of pure reasoning, Escobar offers senti pensar, or feel think, as a refusal of colonial dichotomies and a means of encountering new notions about what is real and thus possible. Our actions are compelled by deduction and induction, yes, but also by desire, fear, loyalty, comfort, and so on. To paraphrase a viral tweet, I don't know that I can explain to anyone why you should care about other people, but I need to believe I can show you. If I met Evelyn in my world, I doubt we would even get along. But early in this movie, there's a scene. After Joy brings her girlfriend Becky home, the visit goes predictably sideways. When Evelyn and Joy bicker, I swear I've heard these words almost verbatim from my own mother. I swear I have walked the same 50 feet of pavement to my car where Joy stands with one arm braced against the door. But everything everywhere is shot from Evelyn's point of view. When Joy storms out of her parents' laundromat, the camera follows Evelyn, who abandons a customer mid-conversation to catch Joy before she gets into the car. Close in on Evelyn. If I could, I would give Michelle Yeoh a whole other Oscar for those 5 seconds of film, where her gaze holds several generations of mutual hurt, striving, and failure. And she says, "You have to try to eat healthier. You're getting fat." In the movie, it's so obvious that none of those words mean what they say. In my life, I got in the car, and I never quite found my way back. Having more stories at our disposal isn't just a matter of what the New Yorker dismisses as feel-good representation. It's about having models for knowing how things were, are, and could be. In another timeline, Donald Trump dubs COVID-19 the China virus, and it's just one of his inchoate ramblings. The American public knows Chinese people and Chinese Americans to be diverse, variegated whole people not reducible to a distant governmental regime. The chances of strangers mistaking Thai Americans and Burmese Americans as Chinese are non-existent because we, of course, are not all the same. And even if someone could not trace the sprawling networks of power, extraction, and deprivation that brought different Asian subgroups to the West, they could not hate the very idea of a person so much to kill them, to continue beating them, while their wife is still waiting for them to come home. In this timeline, though, in the world where Chinese migrants have long been conflated with deviance and disease, the phrase China virus moves with the blunt force of history. The Page Act, one of the first uses of federal law to bar any group from immigration, targeted Asian women under the assumption or the pretense that they were all prostitutes, quote unquote, carrying STDs. When the bubonic plague reached Honolulu in 1899, the Board of Health attempted to cleanse the city by setting fire to Chinatown, displacing 5,000 people. White residents corralled the fire victims into refugee camps using baseball bats and pick handles. Follow this strand of history into 2021, when visitors empty out of Chinatowns and Asian-owned businesses. Yao Pan Ma, who'd been a dim sum pastry chef before he immigrated to the US, loses his job amid COVID shutdowns. He's collecting cans from the street to help make rent when he's struck from behind. Surveillance footage shows his assailant stomping on his head as he loses consciousness, descending into an 8-month coma before dying on New Year's Eve. 3 months earlier, Visha Ratanapakdi, an 84-year-old Thai immigrant, is also killed on camera during his morning walk. In the first draft of this talk, I keep going. I give you the names of more Asian Americans and how they died, sweeping the sidewalk, driving to the grocery store, but I don't want to stand in front of audiences as one of a handful of Asian Americans in the room, pleading for anyone to care. Instead, I'll say that a couple of weeks after Ratanapakdi's death, Media Matters searched the transcripts of major news networks, including CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, and NBC, for mentions of violence targeting Asian Americans, Asians, Pacific Americans, and other related terms. They found only 20 minutes of airtime on MSNBC and negligible to no coverage among the other networks. If I'm honest, I also want to tell you their stories because I'm worried you won't believe me. And that emotion, too, is knowledge, is something learned by experience. In the story more people have heard, a white man murdered 8 people in Atlanta, including 6 women of Asian descent. The police captain notoriously told reporters that the shooter targeted these women not because they were Asian, but because he had a sex addiction and viewed them as a, quote, temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. Writer Meredith Toulousan points out, Asian women are so often disregarded or presumed passive that they vanished from the headlines about their own deaths. Yes. Because history rhymes with itself, the limited coverage of recent anti-Asian violence has been reluctant to name race or racism, except to blame Black communities. Even though the majority of anti-Asian attacks were conducted by white men, a few involving Black men comprised the bulk of the coverage. The Washington Post detailed a history of mistrust between Black communities and Asian immigrant communities, neglecting not only histories of solidarity and mutual aid, but also the fact that this mistrust was engineered by white elites. Amid the abolition of slavery, white officials imported Asian indentured servants as cheap labor, specifically detailing this plan to, quote, create a racial barrier between whites and the people they had enslaved. And after exhausting their need for such labor, majority white communities razed entire Chinatowns, dragging people from their homes, killing or abandoning them by the railroad tracks they had built. Because history rhymes with itself, the expulsion of Chinese workers was enabled by the same measures used to drive out Latino miners. Because history rhymes with itself, California policies against Chinese immigration were derived from the Black codes of the Reconstruction South. Because history rhymes with itself, the US now accuses China of stealing American jobs after half a century of outsourcing cheap labor to Asia. In the story of what Erin Nin calls the debt-bound daughter, the immigrant moves west so that their child has a better life. If that child fails, drops out of college, as Joy does, then she has squandered her family's sacrifice. If she succeeds, then her debt only increases in value. Her life is always already owed to someone else. In the story of the forever foreigner, if Joy fails, then she's evidence of Eastern frailty to Western strength. If she succeeds, then she becomes proof of American generosity, opening its doors to the less fortunate. And in the story of the model minority, if Joy fails, she becomes yet another unseen, unheard Asian American woman. If she succeeds, then she assimilates into the indistinguishable masses of Asian American industriousness. It would seem there's no path that does not take her closer to her own erasure. Many recent accounts of anti-Asian violence attribute Asian invisibility to the model minority myth while neglecting its origins in the Black civil rights era. Only when America needed a story of itself devoid of racial animus. When it needed a human shield against its own violent history, did it devise a means of Asian American uplift. The term model minority, the Asian Americanists in the room will know, comes from a 1966 article in which sociologist William Peterson remarks on the rapid assimilation of Japanese Americans after their mass incarceration in World War II. He praised them for tackling their studies, quote, like a military campaign against the hostile world. So built into the definition of the model minority is one, the willingness to accept injustice quietly, and two, academic achievement as proof of one's patriotism. Peterson leaves out the mandatory Americanization classes delivered in these camps, where some lived for years. He doesn't say that this context catalyzed a marked shift where a generation of children pivoted away from a previously insular community. He doesn't say that family separation is an old tactic of white supremacy. Instead, he authors a story that gets weaponized over and over again against communities of color in the United States. Here are the minorities who made it. Why can't you? The minorities who made it include generations of refugees whose countries were devastated by US Cold War policy. They include Asian American adoptees uprooted, at times kidnapped by US empire. They include lowered caste South Asians whose oppressions remain largely illegible to Westerners who can't see the diversity of the most populous continent in the world. They include many Muslim Americans subjected to US surveillance and persecution. When expanded into AANHPI to include Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, the category can conflate Native Islanders with the settlers who displaced them. It's not that the model minority isn't real. It's that it's instrumental in colonialism and anti-Blackness, and in the US interventionism and militarism that are the reason many don't have a country to go back to. To speak of the model minority in a vacuum settles for uncritical comparisons in place of thinking relationally about how empire is built and sustained. Toward the end of the movie, Evelyn follows Joy out into the parking lot again. Technically, this is supposed to be the redemption arc. Evelyn confronted her father. She's prepared to embrace Joy's queer relationship, but Joy runs out the door anyway. And when she's in the parking lot, choking on the words, I'm tired, I don't want to hurt anymore, I can't catch my breath. The scene that shatters me, though, happens just afterwards, and it's objectively ridiculous. Jobu Tupaki, Joy's alter ego, has chased Evelyn through the multiverse, through worlds alternately mundane and incredible, and we wind up in a silent landscape where the Earth never became inhabitable for any form of life. So Joy and Evelyn are rocks. Captioned but unspoken dialogue appears across the screen. Evelyn tries to apologize. She says that she feels stupid, and Joy replies, God, please, we're all stupid. For most of our history, we knew the Earth was the center of the universe. We killed and tortured people for saying otherwise. That is, until we discovered that the Earth is actually revolving around the sun, which is just one sun out of trillions of suns. Every new discovery is just a reminder that we're all small and stupid. And back in the parking lot, Evelyn says maybe tomorrow's discovery will make us feel like even smaller pieces of shit. No matter what, I still want to be here with you. And when Joy's rock tumbles off the cliff's edge, Evelyn's rock follows. This is the magic of storytelling, right? That if I sit in someone's story, if I let it carry me into the unimaginable, I find myself here, dropping off the edge, falling and breaking for these characters who aren't even human. What I'm trying to say is that everything is connected. That every time someone has told me I don't deserve to be here, in this room, on this campus, in this country, I feel it through the force of history. The multiverse collapses, and I'm 17 driving up and down I-10 because I don't know where to sleep for the night. I'm 27, and I feel the spatter of saliva before I hear the words go back to China. I'm 37 as of last month, and wondering, for what? What am I doing here in this job of obscene privilege? Which is to say, I agree, I should not be here. If the data can be trusted, as an autistic person, in 8 out of 10 timelines, I'm unemployed. As a trans person, in 9 out of 10 timelines, I don't go to graduate school. As a person with myalgic encephalomyelitis, in 1 out of 4 timelines, I'm housebound. As someone with a PhD, in 4 out of 5 timelines, I don't get a tenure-track job. Many of those statistics also don't account for intermediary factors like race, class, the ability to mask, and so on. They don't account for the fact that I managed to connect with some of the most giant-hearted, fierce people and advocates. By an immeasurable calculus of privilege, luck, and community, I am one of the ones who made it. And in these spaces with so much knowledge and resources at our disposal, I'm wondering, how are we spending our time and energy? How has this reality constrained our imagination, and how do we dream differently? Even though a lot of my work draws from personal experience, I actually did not start that way. I'm glad to do it now, and I've developed a better toolkit for navigating the minefield that it is to do so. But I'm realizing that I came to write from personal experience after being told enough times to stay in my lane. And that lane looks like carving myself open to say, this hurts. And to be clear, I tell these stories primarily for trans and queer and disabled people of color who might find in them a handhold or some solid earth on which to stand. I want us to have more stories, and I want those stories to be heard. But there's no version of me telling these stories in this world, and especially in academia, that does not require fashioning a bow and arrow designed specifically to find my heart. Some people navigate this with much more skill and strength than I do, and still others will never get the chance to. I'm not saying anything new. Audre Lorde delivered The Uses of Anger in 1981 as a keynote at the National Women's Studies Association. This Bridge Called My Back, canonized for its criticisms of academia, was first published that same year. In 2012, Presumed Incompetent assembled a mosaic depicting so many universities shaped by cruelty. Its second edition came out in 2020. Within and outside of the Academy, over and over again, writers, artists, and storytellers hold out a weapon in the shape of their pain. If this were an argument, this is where I would say we need better ways of receiving and holding and acting on these offerings. I would say that to recognize a story as meaningful knowledge is not to stash it away as data, but to let it sunder our realities. Among the more substantive criticisms about Everything Everywhere was that the messaging was too heavy-handed, too sentimental. And I get that. I'm the last person who thinks be kind is going to solve all this violence. But I do believe there is something radical in choosing connection in a world that encourages and rewards selfishness, in building community across distance and attempted division, in humbling ourselves before the inevitability of failure and trying differently after we fail. If we aren't willing to do that, if we aren't willing to honor the fullness of others' humanity and the limitations of our own, then what are we doing here?